I am Cecilia Rios Aguilar, and it is an honor to welcome you this morning. I would like to start our program today with a land acknowledgement. As a land-grant institution, the Department of Education in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. As chair of the Department of Education, as a faculty co-director of PACE, and as an active member of AERA, I welcome you to UCLA on this exciting day. We also arranged the weather for those of you who travel. We made sure it was very pleasant. I want to start by thanking people who made today's event possible. And I want to start with our dean, our standing Dean, Tina Christie, and our amazing staff in the School of Education and Information Studies, with a special attention to Megan. Where are you, Megan? Here. Thank you, Megan. You always go above and beyond. And also I want to thank our school's communications team, which I know are always there, taking pictures, making sure that everybody knows about the great things that happen in our school. Thank you to the director of CREST, our dear colleague, Lee Kai, for his support, and the CREST communications team as well. Thank you to Heather Ho, director of PACE, for their support and collaboration in today's event. As I think you know, this event grew out of a special issue of educational assessment on fairness in educational assessment and the next edition of the standards, edited by our dear colleague, Joan Herman, chief editor, who sadly was not able to join us today, and associate editors Alison Bailey, Jose Felipe Martinez, and Guillermo Solano-Flores. I really want to thank Joan because she passed me her notes today. She was supposed to be doing this. I want to say a very special gracias to our graduate student representatives from the social research methods and the human development and psychology programs for the invaluable logistical and organization support they provided. Let me read all of your names. First, our SRM students, Lisette Rojas, who very ably led the charge, Amanda Giuliano, Andres Fernandez Vergara, Ryan Lerch, and Flora Sempleni. And our HDP students, Juno Dong, Dena Gohari, Yifei Wang, and Flora Cyprin. Thank you very much. We're in community today because we need to connect with one another. We're here to reflect, to be critical, and to reimagine assessment in the field of education, and to take very seriously issues of fairness and racial equity. Most importantly, we're here because we must utilize this knowledge to change our practices. It is very imperative that we support our educational systems. Schools and all its actors, practitioners, educators, policymakers, they need the best of our scholarship. Our students, particularly those who have been historically marginalized and underserved, need us to do better for them. It is an honor now to introduce you to our Dean, Tina Christie, who will give us welcoming remarks. Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Cecilia. I think I'm just going to reread her remarks right here. Thank you, Cecilia. You are outstanding in so many ways as a scholar, a colleague, and as the leader of our Department of Education here in the School of Education and Information Studies. It's my honor to welcome all of you to the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies and to our discussion today on re-envisioning fairness in educational assessment and the opportunities to do so through the next edition of the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing, prepared by the Joint Committee on the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing of the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement in Education. The standards were last published in 2014, and much has happened in education and in the world since then. Advances in how we think about issues of validity, procedures for increasing reliability and reducing error, that's my New York accent, by the way, and fairness. Who designs and develops tests and assessments in education, for what purposes, test administration, interpretation of scores, and the intended and unintended uses of tests and assessments. This important work is happening during a time when a growing number of states have established restrictions on schools. As those engaged as professionals in this discussion, increasingly we are confronted by disturbing political trends that directly threaten our schools and our youth. Many of us in this room today have been steadfast champions of socially just policies and practices in education, and we now find ourselves facing attacks that aim to undermine the hard-fought progress made in recent decades. One clear example can be seen in the attacks on critical race. As Kimberly Williams Crenshaw argues, for more than 40 years, CRT has been, quote, an embodiment of racial literacy. In other words, a way of understanding how racism is part of everyday life and the ways in which individuals can fuel it. While CRT is not new, it is the latest pawn in discussions stemming from broader fears about power relations, resource scarcity, and a changing status quo. CRT Forward, a project of the UCLA School of Law Critical Race Studies program, recently reported that there have been 750 anti-critical race theory measures at the federal, state, and local levels so far in 2023. Justice scholars like Jennifer Randall raised these issues in the context of testing and assessment, and as we produce the next edition of the standards. This is why our discussion this morning is of such great consequence. And I will say to you, too, that where this discussion is transpiring here at UCLA is also of great importance. Last week, we welcomed our student and faculty community back to campus to begin our school year. In my convocation remarks, I shared that it is common to hear that academic work can be best understood as a conversation. In our research and writing, we join a conversation already in progress. We listen and consider what's being said before, and then make our own thoughtful contributions informed by life experience, the research we have conducted, and the lenses through which we view the world. As in any good conversation, there is room for many voices, and there is space for agreement as well as dissension. And when the conversation is rich and thoughtful, it pushes us forward. Our conversation today is an extension of a conversation, a discussion, recently published in a special issue of Educational Assessment, organized by my distinguished UCLA colleagues, Joan Herman, Felipe Martinez, and Allison Bailey, and spoken into by the most eminent voices in the field, who are also here with us today. At UCLA, our discussion on assessment and other issues of great concern to education predate the establishment of the university in 1919 and began in 1881 when we were founded as a state normal school. While our conversations on fairness and assessment have been ongoing for more than a century, it was the founding of the Center for the Study of Evaluation in the late 1960s, and then, a bit later, the Center for the Study of Evaluation, CSE, we go by acronyms. And when I have to read them out loud, it was a National Center for Research on Evaluation Standards and Student Testing, known across the world most commonly as CREST. And we And we became the most notable university-based centered focused on testing and assessment in education. Our work at CREST has been focused on advancing research, science, and technologies in these areas, while also speaking to issues of practice in policy with the purpose of improving educational outcomes for all of our students, educators, and the systems in which they operate. The standards that we're talking about today are illustrative of this purpose. State-of-the-art research and test development for use, ideally, by test developers, policymakers, and practitioners. And the national group of experts convened here today is an excellent example of collaboration amongst researchers and practitioners around a critical issue at its best, to be sure that the quote-unquote best practices are outlined in the standards, and of equal importance, how these standards are implemented and will be of critical importance as districts and states increase their reliance on tests and testing technology. It is an enormous privilege to welcome our guests today, Drs. Hough, Randall, Bennett, Solano-Flores, Tong, Huff, and AERA's president and my dear friend, Dr. Tyrone Howard. And I extend my gratitude and appreciation to the thought leaders at UCLA who organized this conversation today, Professors Herman, Martinez, Bailey, and of course, to our leaders, Professor Tsai and Eva Baker, who I know are here today. Collectively and individually, you are the ones who will push our thinking forward, addressing the most serious opportunities and challenges ahead. You have chosen to be part of the discussion on fairness because you appreciate and are committed to advancing robust conversations around this broad goal. To those of you who join us as participant members, we welcome the addition of your voices to this most powerful and forward-moving discussion. We are eager for you to join us in this work, and we are pleased that you are part of the conversation. I hope you enjoy the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. I want to now introduce my colleague, Heather Hough, Director of PACE, who will also give us brief remarks. Thank you, Heather.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I am so happy to be here with you today at this very important event. My name is Heather Huff. I am the Executive Director of PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education. PACE is a statewide research organization that really aims to blend research, policy, and practice, and we do work from pre-K through K-12 through higher education. I'm really glad that we're talking today about assessment and particularly fairness in assessment because we're at a critical juncture in education and we need now to make investments that help us know how to improve our systems for the future. I think we all know that the pandemic has highlighted both inequity in our system, but also the need for action to remedy those inequities and to help students recover from what was a very traumatic time and move forward into a positive learning structure. We also know COVID-19 was hard on all students, but particularly hard on our most vulnerable students. There's a lot of talk in the media and policy and classrooms about far behind students are and about the need to accelerate their learning to catch them up. And indeed, our statewide assessments do show that students are behind where they would have been without the pandemic. In California, in 21-22, 33% of students met or exceeded state standards in math. And for some students, that number is a lot lower. For example, for our Black students, 15.9%. And that's a decline of 4.62 percentage points. These data should definitely prompt us to action. We need to make sure that our students are learning and that we use the information that we have. But we also need to ask the kinds of questions that we will be asking today in this conference. Are these assessments telling us what we really need to know about student learning? Are they showing us true differences between groups, or are they showing us the bias in our assessments? And I know we all care deeply and want all kids to thrive, and we also want our systems to be fair and to be equitable. And today, I am hoping that we can make really good progress in terms of building some plans and wrapping our heads around what those paths forward might look like. And as we're doing that, I also want us to consider a couple of key questions. The first is, how do we think about assessments in a broader set of metrics for how we think about the student experience in school, student outcomes, both in learning and in the types of things that they want to achieve in their life? And I also want us to consider the context in which assessments are used, because even the best assessments are only useful to the extent that educators and policymakers are using this information to make better decisions about how we improve instructional approaches for students and how we improve our systems overall. So I'm very hopeful that with the amazing group of speakers and attendees in the room, we can have a great discussion today and all of us come out with ideas about how we can improve our research and our practice, and we can start working toward the vision, not just of fair assessments, but of fair educational systems. Thank you so much for coming today.
Before we turn to our panel, let me give you just a quick overview of the sessions for today. And let me introduce our distinguished speakers for this morning's panel. Each of their backgrounds and experiences are incredibly impressive. And we could spend probably the rest of just today going through their CVs and bios and all their accomplishments. But in the interest of time, I'm just going to tell you their names and affiliations and refer you to their bios in the conference program for a fuller description of their many accomplishments. So here we go. Because of a scheduling challenge, we're going to start with my esteemed colleague, Tyrone Howard, Professor of Education here at UCLA and current President of the American Educational Research Association, one of the sponsors of the standards. Tyrone will provide context for today's discussion. Then we will move to the special issue authors, Jennifer Randall, Don Family Endowed Professor of Psychometrics and Test Development at the University of Michigan. Randy Bennett, Norman O. Frederickson Chair in Assessment Innovation at Educational Testing Service, ETS. Guillermo Solano-Flores, Professor of Education at Stanford University. Finally, we will hear commentary from Tong, Senior Vice President for Assessment Operations, NBME, and former President of the National Council on Measurement in Education, a second sponsor of the standards. And Kristen Huff, Vice President for Assessment and Research at Curriculum Associates and NCME representative of the Standards Management Committee. The special issue asks whether our conceptualization of fairness, both key themes and specific standards, need to change in response to the current public discourse and to advances in theory and practice. This plenary session asks the same question, and the two breakout rooms that follow additionally consider what changes in research, policy, and practice are needed. Each of the main speakers will have 12 to 15 minutes to share their perspectives, followed by the discussants who will have been asked to limit their time to 8 to 10 minutes. I'm sure we'll keep ourselves in time, so we'll have enough time for questions and answers at the end. Without further ado, I want to introduce my colleague, Tyrone Howard.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. All right, there we go. Okay. Maybe everyone's caffeine has not kicked in yet. Let me say my honor and privilege to be here with you this morning. I want to apologize in advance because, as my dear colleague mentioned, I've got to be in two places at one time. So I'm going to stir some stuff up, then I'll run out and let you all figure it out, okay? Let me say also I am just appreciative of my colleagues. Allison Bailey, as well as Jose Felipe Martinez for this event and for the invitation to be a part of this discussion. I think it's an important one. And this does not happen without having some really, really impressive and important leadership in our department. I'm looking at not my colleagues, my dear friends, Dean Tina Christie, and our fair chair, Cecilia Rios Aguilar. Thank you for your leadership. We do better when women are in charge. This is my 2 cents, right? Okay. I really want to try to think about something my mother always told my brother and I as I frame my remarks in my context, is that she would say, sometimes there's a need to say things that need to be said that folks don't want to hear, but have to be heard. And I think as we think about this conversation around the re-envisioning in fairness and educational assessment and the next edition of standards, I want to try to say some things that need to be said that I think maybe those of us in this room understand that, but I don't know if our larger, broader communities understand that. So when I think about assessment, I think what we have to recognize that the history of assessment and evaluation in this country when it comes to education has not been pretty for all folks in this country. And I think we need to say that. I think we need to lean into that. We need to acknowledge the fact that evaluation oftentimes has some very ugly roots when it comes to the ways in which it's been used as tools around the ways we understand people of color in this country. And I raise that because we still, while we've made significant progress when it comes to the evaluation and tools we use around assessment, people of color and folks from low-income backgrounds have oftentimes been on the receiving end of being demonized and being viewed through deficit lens by those very tools. We need to say that, we need to recognize that, and we need to be sure that as we think about the next set of standards, we don't reinscribe some of those same approaches. Doesn't make you very popular to say those things, but again, we have to be upfront and honest about the fact that these issues are all too real. When you think about the long history of assessment, I don't have to go into the detail, but I think it's worth mentioning that when you think about the history of eugenics in terms of how it played a role in assessment, the work of folks like who are held up in high regard, the Lewis Termans and the Benets, all the folks who measured intelligence and used this as a tool to continue to reinforce the idea that certain people were less than, still has its remnants in educational testing today. And again, so as we think about revising standards, if that conversation is not front and center, then shame on us for not recognizing that. Moreover, what I'll also ask us to think about is that I think about my role in the current capacity of being the president of the American Educational Research Association, that we oftentimes talk about that our mission is to strive to advance knowledge about education and to encourage scholarly inquiry for the promotion of the public good. And I think that sounds good in the abstract, but the devil's always in the details. And I think evaluation and assessment should be part of what we're asking. Is this being done for the public good? At a time, as Dean Christie recognized, that we have so much misinformation, we have so many attacks on critical race theories, we have over 400 pieces of legislation that have been either introduced or that have passed that are anti-LGBTQ+, that context matters as we think about the issues around assessment and evaluation. So as we re-envision our standards, I ask us to think about that. We must remember that not all tests are well developed, not all testing practices are wise or beneficial, but when they are done right and when they are done well, and when they're done with a sense of integrity and validity, we know that they can be really powerful and important and useful to help us to understand how we inform practice and policy. The question is, how do we get to that point where we can have those kind of tools that are going to serve those purposes? So part of what's important, as you all know, about the standards is that it should provide us with the criteria for the development of testing and assessment practices, a frame of reference for all folks who choose to engage in different tools to assess and evaluate to help our knowledge base, that we are giving them core sort of standards that are based on the premise that everyone who does testing operates with a core set of knowledge, skills, and practices that are essential in this process. But as we think about these re-envisions of standards, I ask us to think about some of the critiques that have been leveraged around issues around assessment and evaluation. And again, I think it's important to lift these up, and hopefully these will be part of our conversation throughout the course of the time that we are here this morning. As that issues around validity still continue to come up time and time again. How are we thinking about validity? How is validity being conceptualized in a manner that recognizes that we should be finding the same results across different kinds of ways that we assess? Validity needs to be talked about in this current moment, because this current moment matters for a variety of reasons that I'll get into in a moment. But we're also thinking about reliability. How reliable are our tools? Are they reliable for the context of today's student population? I come to this from a K-12 context, and I oftentimes think about the fact that our demography in K-12 schools is changing rapidly, but are our tools changing right along with them? And I would argue that they are not. And that's the elephant in the room that we don't discuss. We're at a time when you look at the work of a number of demographers, including William Fry, he tells us, he estimates that by the year 2030, 2/3 of our students in K-12 schools will be students of color. That is a dramatic shift that should help us to rethink about the very tools and standards that we use to assess today's student population. But it doesn't stop there. We also know that 1 in 5 of those students will either be immigrants themselves or the sons and daughters of immigrants. So what does that mean for our tools as we assess today's student population? But it doesn't stop there. We also know that of those students, of the 50 million students, 10 million of those students' first language will not be English. And that number will only continue to increase. How do we assure that we have issues tied to reliability and validity when we have a rapidly changing student population? And oh, by the way, this is occurring at a time where our teaching population is still incredibly racially homogenous. So we've got an increased student population racially, ethnically, ethnically, racially, and linguistically, but a teaching population that's overwhelmingly white. Our tools are going to have to help educators begin to think about how they respond in this current moment. I also raise this from the standpoint that we have to think about not just validity, not just reliability, but also bias. And part of what I want to acknowledge that with the current standards, there's mention of bias and the problems that come with bias. I hope that in the re-envisioning or the reimagining of bias, we name certain types of bias. There's racial bias. There's cultural bias. There's language bias. We can't talk about this in a very sort of milquetoast kind of opaque way that doesn't get into the types of biases that we know that play out all too often. The bottom line is this: we know that assessment tools have been one of the primary mechanisms that have been used to reinscribe hierarchies of the very students that we oftentimes want to see do well. I think while assessment tools have been part of the problem, this is an opportunity for assessment tools to be part of the solution to undo what has been done. So as we think about this, there also has to be issues tied to ethics as we think about assessment tools. How do we think ethically about the reimagining of tools and assessment in its current moment? Because this moment is pivotal for so many reasons. It's critical because we are also living in a moment, as was mentioned earlier, that we continue to see what I call the political context in which we live, where we have lots of misinformation that's sort of in our ecosystem, asking us to think about what is truth, what is not truth. We see a massive movement around book banning in this country. Oftentimes, educators are at a loss in terms of what they can teach, what they cannot teach. That has major implications for assessment in terms of whose knowledge or what knowledge is most valuable or most important enough to be assessed and evaluated. So there's a context moment that has a political set of ramifications associated with it. There's also a COVID context that we have to be mindful of. One of the things I've been intrigued by, just as a higher ed scholar, and many of you have seen the same thing, there have been, I get lots of requests like you all do to do assessments for folks who are coming up for promotion and tenure. And what I've really appreciated from a number of institutions is that they've said, we ask you to evaluate said member within the context of what COVID has meant for all of us. We asked you to evaluate this particular faculty member in light of the fact that we have tried to allot additional time. We tried to allot additional resources to ensure that this person has had the ample time to address COVID. I think that's the right ethically and moral thing to do, is to think about sort of the growth and the development and the sort of the evaluation of a scholar in light of the current moment. I'm wondering if we show the same kind of grace for those folks who are in schools today, young people. Do we think about the development of assessment tools given the current COVID moment, right, that we're still in my opinion, right? We're only 3 years removed from schools being completely shut down. We're still seeing close to 17 million students who have been diagnosed with some type of mental health disorder. How do our tools ethically think about the ways in which they address the COVID moment that we're currently living in? I think that there's an ethical component to how we think about evaluation that cannot be sort of minimized in this current moment. So I want us to think about how we begin to have the hard conversations and recognizing that how can evaluation, how can assessment, and I really want us to push hard on what does it mean when we talk about fairness. Fairness for whom? Fairness that recognizes the folks who have consistently been privileged in the ways in which we look at testing, or a much more broader conceptualization of fairness that's centered around issues around justice, recognizing past harm, and then a sense of belonging and how we create tools and testing that are allowing us to begin to not say what's wrong with young people. And again, I'm in the K-12 context, so please forgive me if I'm excluding my higher ed colleagues, no disrespect. But for years, we have said what's wrong with the students, and I'm asking us to say what's wrong with the tools used to assess them. I've always maintained that our young people are fine. Our young people are thriving. Our young people have more intellect and more knowledge than we ever give them credit for. But oftentimes, it's the very mechanisms and tools that we use that do not capture the essence of their intellect, their brilliance, and their sheer genius that shows up every single day. So as we think about fairness, let's not sort of reinforce the language of pathology around poor children and children of color. Let's think about what do tools look like that begin to recognize the changing demography of our schools, the ways in which the history of evaluation has not served them well, but how do we face this pivotal moment in a time that can begin to rebrand, recreate a set of standards that we will look back on in time and say, this was the time where we said that evaluation would do something different, something inclusive, something that's just and belonging. So I'll leave you with that, and I thank you for your time. And I'm going to run. Thank you.
That was fast, but that was powerful. Thank you, Tyrone. I want to now introduce Jennifer Randall, who's going to get us started today.
Thank you for having me here. It's really an honor to be here and talk about these issues. And I'm looking forward to engaging in conversations for the rest of the morning with everyone. Like I said, some of the things that Dr. Howard brought up, I really want to chime in on. The title of my presentation is Leaning into Justice and Away from Fear. Just yesterday, I was given a talk at CREA, which was founded by the late Stanford Hough. And someone grabbed this quote from somewhere a couple of days and shared it with me. And several people came up and was like, this sounds just like Jennifer Randall. As soon as they read it. And yes, this sounds just like Jennifer Randall. Dr. Hough was unapologetic in the ways in which he addressed issues related to culture and specifically race and I think racism. And I'm going to begin this talk with how I'll end this talk and say, as we move forward with the standards, if we are not centering justice throughout those standards, I have no use for them. I am unapologetically justice-oriented and anti-racist, and I think this is what the standards need to do as well. I think the standards need to be unapologetically centered on justice and be anti-racist. I think we have to move away from this fear that if we put something in those standards, individuals like Ron DeSantis and Mitch McConnell are going to get upset with us and they're going to raise all kinds of hell. I think as a field, we need to be a lot more bold. I think as a field, we need to lean into justice and not into fear. I'm done with being afraid of racists and homophobes and Islamophobes. I've had it up to here, and I hope that the people in this room have also had it up to here. And that's what we're going to see as we move forward in the standards. At least I'm hoping for that. The goal, and I also want to say, I want to be clear that I know that doing the standards is a lot of work. And that there have been people in this room for years who spend years, every 10 to 15 years, working on those freaking standards. That it goes through multiple iterations and people are really thoughtful about what goes into the standards. And the chapter on fairness was added the last time, which was 2014. And a chapter on fairness did not exist before that. So I recognize that steps are being taken. I guess also what I'm saying is that more steps need to be taken. Dr. Solano-Flores, I don't know where you wrote it, Dr. Flores, but you wrote it somewhere and then I wrote it down. And when talking about the chapter on fairness, Dr. Flores said, the chapter reads more like a set of guidelines than test developers are expected to address, not obliged to address at their discretion. So when referring to processes and methods to employ to ensure fairness, the word should shows up way more frequently than it ought to and than it ought to. And whenever possible, just shows up over and over and over again. I think the standards could absolutely do more. And I think you agree with me, Dr. Solano-Flores. I probably think they could do way more than anybody in here wants them to do. But I do think that we can do a lot more. And so I include a couple of examples here on the screen. At the top, you see the standards read, those responsible for test development should include relevant subgroups and validity, reliability, precision, etc. Doesn't say must, says should, which of course sounds a lot like a recommendation than like a mandate, because it is a recommendation and not a mandate. And although a lot of test developers do this, enough don't, especially those who are developing psychosocial measures of our Black children, measures that have traditionally and continue to pathologize Blackness and to normalize whiteness. I'd like to point out for the record that it is not really near about going to get close enough to grab a bunch of Black people off the street and say, please take this measure and let's see what's happening. Now, you should do that. Let me be clear. You need to grab some Black people off the street and do this. But that is not enough. You need to get other people into the room, critical scholars, people who think about all the time the ways in which Blackness is pathologized and whiteness is held supreme or elevated in those spaces. On the bottom one, you see here subgroup differences, mean differences, do not, in fact, in and of themselves indicate a lack of fairness. But such differences should trigger follow-up studies where feasible to identify the potential causes, blah, 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 blah. Now, we all know, because I know as a parent, I say stuff like, well, if it's possible or if it's feasible, when I want my children to walk away, when I know good and doggone well, I'm going to make the decision that it's not possible. But I want them to shut up and leave me be. That is what's happening here, right? It is a get out of jail free card for test developers. It says, tell me you can do this thing or you should do this thing if it's feasible. So when someone like me says, why didn't you do this thing? They can always respond with, because it wasn't feasible, which is really just code for, it probably would have cost too much money and your humanity wasn't worth that much money to me. So I argue that the standards fall down repeatedly with respect to teeth, the thing that that forces people to do what we call fairness. But again, it's expected the first time out. You have a whole lot of masters with the standards, AERA, APA, NCME, and all of them have their constituents who are hell-bent on not getting sued because they fail to employ a standard mandate, and rather have the option, all of them, of ignoring fairness recommendations. I can appreciate the whisper that we have here, even if at the time people weren't willing to yell, and maybe, possibly, I'm not sure, the more I think about it, I think maybe I can't. But maybe I could have waited a little while and lived with some of these recommendations. But what I'm about to show you here is what I cannot live with that shows up in the standards. This passage that you see here on the screen, which is also taken from that chapter in the fairness standards, that chapter on fairness. Now, I will say historically the field of measurement has considered the inclusion of linguistic, communicative, and cultural characteristics in test items as construct irrelevant variance. And the standards state explicitly here that test developers should use language in tests that is consistent with the purposes of the test and that is familiar to as wide a range of test takers as possible. Now, if you look at this without a critical lens, such an approach seems like it has this illusion of neutrality and of fairness. But in reality, these practices only serve to maintain and support the current white supremacist hegemony. I argue, for example, that familiar to as wide a range of test takers as possible is simply coded language for you must use white mainstream English. Put simply, the standards, however unintentionally here, call for test developers to ignore or to exclude the linguistic and cultural characteristics associated with, for example, Black culture, in favor of or to privilege the linguistic and cultural characteristics associated with whiteness. Now, Professor A. Wade Boykin said many years ago, back in the 1980s, when talking about the triple quandary with Black students, that what we have managed to do in this country is basically convince people that Black people have culture, a thing that is meaningless and ultimately irrelevant, and white people have civilization. And this is what you see, it shows up on our test, on our assessments, and in our standards, is this idea that everything that represents Blackness is culture and not needed and irrelevant. And everything else that represents whiteness is the stuff that actually does matter. And given what Professor Howard said just 10 minutes ago about how the United States is becoming increasingly racially, ethnically, and linguistically diverse, we have to reconsider our position there. And here's another example of where I see the standards fail to take the opportunity to actively disrupt white supremacist logics. So it says expert and sensitivity reviews can serve to guard against all these things that we've talked about before, construct irrelevant language and images. And test publishers should conduct sensitivity reviews of test material to detect and remove sensitive materials from the test. That's what my paper is actually about, this idea of bias and sensitivity, because I say that disrupting white supremacist logics is going to be a disrupting political act that is going to be offensive to those out there who are insisting on maintaining our current white supremacist hegemony. So here on the screen, I tried to put as many examples of people up here so that no one testing company would think that I was picking on them, because I am picking on all of them, every single one of them represented in this room and elsewhere. But obviously what I wanted to talk about here is the bias and sensitivity review process, which is the topic of my paper, because it represents our rules when we actually get down to test development. Where do the standards show up in this very applied space? What gets shown? What do students get on a test? And what immediately gets removed from the test before a kid even has the opportunity to see it? And I've been arguing for a while here that, again, our bias and sensitivity standards really lean into fear and don't do a good job at all of even thinking about justice. In fact, when you think about fairness and sensitivity, it really is an attempt to offend as few people as possible, and especially those people who have power. And I want us to really encourage us to think about it from a different perspective, a perspective that is really driven by justice. Now, guidelines often have a list of topics that people should avoid and a list of topics that you should use with caution. And in this presentation, I put them all together because I believe that that's a distinction without a difference. If you tell an item writer that you should use caution when talking about this topic, you've basically told an item writer, don't write about this topic or you're going to have to rewrite it 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. So I feel like we say that, but what we really mean is do not write about these particular topics. So here, now there are all kinds of topics that guidelines tell us not to address, a lot of them around social problems and racial justice, but I figured everybody here would think I would pick on those. So I decided to pick on some others that I think are just as stupid. And the first here is experimentation on animals or humans. This shows up across multiple guidelines. People say, let's not talk about this. It should be excluded. Sometimes they say used with caution. So a friend of mine, Pamela Peck, and I, a couple of years ago, sat down and was like, what are people afraid of when they put this into the bias and sensitivity guidelines? What do they think is going to show up on a test? Or what will happen if this shows up on a test? And here's an example of one of the ones we came up with, pretty tame. I'll give you a second to read it. Now, I know this is ridiculous, but it is ridiculous. What do you think is going to happen if you have an item on the test that is about experimentation of some sort? So if you tell people You can't talk about that on the test. Yes, you avoid this. Billy will not go, Billy is not going to go home and start experimenting on his little brother or his cat. But you also avoid items like this. And this is an example of an indisputable human experimentation at the center of an assessment item that is important. Now, it might be hard for people to read this type of item. I like to point out when I put these types of items in front of Black and brown students, none of them were bothered by these types of items. You know who was bothered by these types of items? White people who said, oh, it might bother Black people. That was who was bothered by these types of items, were white people being scared and concerned for us. But anyway, that's a different story. So yes, obviously, this is an item around people who suffered, but it happened. And because of these experiments, it has an impact on how we do science today. I don't know how many people in here have been aggravated by IRB. I am currently being aggravated by IRB, but the reason IRB exists, thank God for them, is because of studies like this. And this should be a part of any science curriculum, any history curriculum. And if it's a part of the curriculum, then it should also be on the assessment. And this is another example here of the same issue that would pop up if we did not allow experimentation to be considered on an assessment. And then we have contemporary biographies. Nearly every set of bias and sensitivity guidelines warns us against having contemporary people on the assessment. And they say flat out, it's because those people might do something next year that is problematic, and then we have to deal with it. For example, if you'd had an item like this 15 years ago about Janet Jackson, a contemporary figure that was really important, I'm sure kids would have definitely had enjoyed that item. And then the year after, we had Nipplegate. I can see how it might be problematic. Problematic in that you'd have to pull the item from the test about Janet Jackson from 2 years ago. I don't see why that's such a big deal. I feel like we could do that, because if you don't do that, then you avoid having items like this, where students are given an opportunity to see themselves in the assessment with people who might actually matter to them today. So by avoiding Nipplegate, we also avoid this. And I'm nearly running out of time here, so I do want to speak to historical biographies, and what many of the bias and sensitivity guidelines point out is that they say some crap like, don't say anything about them if they did something bad. Only say the good shit. And so what you end up with, former social studies teacher, is items like this about Thomas Jefferson on every single social studies test from 3rd grade on to the 12th grade, where they basically say he was the best thing that ever walked on water. He was so freaking smart. He was so brilliant. It is because of him we have freedom. And no one ever mentions on the assessment that this son of a summoned up had slaves, that he raped slaves, that we have evidence of that because his descendants are walking amongst us. So again, this kind of leaning into fear, we can't say anything bad, prevents us from showing people the full picture. And so I'm going to leave you with what a DJ said when she warned about the danger of a single story. She said, that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing and only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. No history, no person is all positive or all negative. Yet routinely in assessments, we identify white historical figures as near flawless heroes, people like Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, indigenous persons as savages, narratives about scalping, and enslaved Africans as weak, powerless, and oppressed. Bias and sensitivity guidelines must shift away from that, perhaps unintentionally, encouraging the dangerous single story through assessments, and instead encourage assessment developers to include a wide range of contemporary and historical biographies that tell a wide range of information. And then I will leave you with one of my favorite quotes, which I tend to leave people with all the time, is this idea that we indeed have to go for broke. If we want to move forward, we cannot do it timidly. We're just not going to get there timidly. We have to really lean into justice. Thank you for listening.
Randy, please join us.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. This talk is titled Towards a Theory of Socioculturally Responsive Assessment, SCRA, the short version. And it's a short version because the long version is in the journal. I'm going to begin with the fundamental premise. And the fundamental premise is we need to rethink our notions of fairness and equity in assessment. And I'm led to that premise by several factors. One is the growing awareness among segments in our society of the imperative for social justice, as motivated by some of the events that you see depicted on the left. A second related factor is the increasing perception of testing as unfair, most obvious in the very rapid growth of test-optional and test-blind policies in the post-secondary admissions context. And finally is the measurement community's own questioning of its fundamental principles, which you can see in conference presentations and seminars sponsored by the NCME, as well as in journal articles appearing throughout the field, the special issue of educational assessment being just one example. I don't believe that this need to rethink fairness and equity in assessment is a temporary phenomenon. And I don't think it's a temporary phenomenon because I think it's part of long-term social change, driven by what Tyrone Howard cited, rapidly changing demographics in our society. In 1980, our population was about 80% Caucasian, or 20% or so people of color. In 2021, only 40 or so years later, the percentage of people of color had doubled to 41%, 59% Caucasian, and by 2060, the projection is for 56% people of color, 44% Caucasian. Our public school population is majority students of color and majority students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And of course, in California, the percentage of students in the school population, public school population, who are of color is 79%. These levels of racial ethnic heterogeneity, as well as other types of heterogeneity that aren't cited here, bring with them very significant levels of cultural diversity. And culture is extremely important in this discussion because, as people like Willy Solano-Flores have been saying for decades now, tests are cultural artifacts. They privilege certain competencies, ways of knowing, forms of representation, modes of expression that are rooted in our nation's dominant common culture. The tests we use today were not designed for the multicultural, pluralistic society we now find ourselves in. The tests we use today were designed for an America that no longer exists. So what do we do about it? A potential solution is to thoughtfully adapt our assessment conceptions and our assessments themselves to the super diverse society that we find ourselves becoming. And of course, the critical question is, well, how do you do that? Well, interestingly, there have been proposals for doing so that go back at least 30 years to Ed Gordon's writings on equitable assessment, as well as a long list of other proposals, principally generated by scholars of color, that have been more recently followed by a slew of new proposals for how to achieve this goal, including ones by me, ones by Jennifer, and ones by a number of others. These different proposals are materially different from one another. They may differ in many ways, including on the factors you see here: definition, goals, the populations they target, the settings in which they're intended to be used, classroom versus large-scale assessment, the literatures they draw upon, the principles they espouse, the theory that describes how it is they're supposed to achieve their goals, the rhetorical stances their proponents take, and the audiences their proponents are trying to convince. But despite those many differences, most of these proposals share at least one key idea in common, and that is to design assessment for the social, cultural, and other relevant characteristics of students and the context from which they come. Well, what exactly does that mean? How do you do that specifically? Well, that depends on which conception you choose to focus upon. I'm going to tell you what I think it means from the perspective of SCRA as I described in the journal article. Here's a working definition that's composed of principles. The principles are the 5 bullets you see in the list. These are not original. They come from multiple literatures. They're re-expressed by me and elaborated upon in the journal article. SCRA includes problems that connect to the cultural identity, background, and lived experiences of all individuals, especially those from traditionally underserved groups. It allows forms of expression and modes of representation that help individuals show what they know and can do. It promotes deeper learning by design. It adapts to personal characteristics, including cultural identity, and it characterizes performance as an interaction among factors coming from within the person as well as from outside of the person. SCRA is assessment that people can see themselves in and that is affirming and from which they can learn. So, if you create assessments according to this definition and principles, what's supposed to happen? This diagram summarizes an initial theory of SCRA that takes the form of a set of empirically testable propositions. On the left are the 5 principles that I just articulated, and to their right are a series of intermediate and ultimate outcomes. These propositions, this theory is described in very elaborate detail in the journal article, so I won't go through it here. I'll just describe one of the propositions or a couple of the propositions to give you an idea of how it's supposed to be read. Using culturally relevant problems in the assessment is theorized to cause examinees to identify with that assessment, thereby increasing their levels of engagement and motivation to perform on the test, resulting in higher test performance, causing an increase in confidence and sense of efficacy, redounding to learning, reflected in higher levels of test performance, a virtuous circle. Including such problems on the assessment is posited to activate the students' prior knowledge, and especially students who are minoritized because they're being presented with problems that are intended to be relevant to them, causing higher test performance, again, entering that virtuous circle. If you read through this theory in any detail, it will become obvious to you that there are probably multiple ways to implement socioculturally responsive assessment. One way is to create a custom assessment for each group of interest, which we already do to a significant extent today based on exceptionality and based on native language. A second, very different way is to let the machine do the customization. Let the machine, in the world of ChatGPT and AI, create a personalized assessment just for you. A third way that's very different still is to let the examinee create the assessment customized for that person. A simple version of that is to offer choice of problems in the assessment, where different problems, different choices have been written in an attempt to be relevant to one or another group of interest in the population. A more complex version of that is to let the examinee design the problem. Design the problem and allow that person to bring his or her background, identity, interests, and prior knowledge into the design and into that solution. And of course, there are other possibilities. If you've thought about what I said for even a moment, it should be obvious to you that each of these approaches brings with it significant challenges. Custom assessments raise the feasibility issue. That is, as the number of groups increases, feasibility decreases, and as the intersections among those groups become more important, sensibility of the approach starts to get weaker and weaker. Machine-driven approaches are very knowledge-intensive. We have to know what are the right variables to personalize upon. We have to be able to measure each of those variables in a meaningful way. We have to understand how those measured variables behave conjointly, and then we have to know what to do with that conjoint behavior. That is, how do we use it in order to adjust the presentation of content and adjust the format and adjust other factors of the problem or the assessment that we're administering to that individual. Examinee-driven approaches raise the challenge of making choice part of the construct and of whether examinees will make choices that in the end benefit them as opposed to disadvantage them. And all of these approaches raise the technical problem of how do we make comparable the evidence coming from different assessment forms. Because in each of these approaches, examinees will be taking different forms, and in the machine-driven and examinee-driven approaches, every examinee will be taking a different form from every other examinee. If you know anything about educational assessment, you'll know we've been around this block before, and not only that, we've been around it many times before. We make adaptations today in operational testing programs that are considered comparable enough in many contexts. We do it based on exceptionality in virtually every major assessment program. We do it for native language in international assessments and in state assessments. We do it for prior knowledge and interests in several advanced placement tests which offer problem choice and have been doing so for decades. We do it for cultural identity in several other advanced placement examinations in which we allow the examinee to create the problem for him or herself, bringing into that problem aspects of identity if they so choose, as well as background and interests. And we do it with respect to test location. Almost every major high-stakes program in graduate and professional admissions, and many also in licensure and certification, allow examinees to take tests at home or at the office or in the test center. Across all of these adaptations, we consider the scores to be comparable enough for the purposes and contexts in which they're to be used. AERA asked the question of, can we design assessment for the social, cultural, and other relevant characteristics of examinees in the context from which they come, and consider the scores to be comparable enough for the purposes for which we want to use them. The challenges to doing so, I think, are conceptual, technical, practical, and political. But as I've just mentioned, we've met these challenges many times before in other contexts. I think a way to start to meet them in this context is through the standards revision. So here are a few suggestions. First, consider putting the fairness chapter at the front. It's currently third, after reliability and after validity. Arguably, reliability is meaningless without fairness, and validity is compromised without fairness. Second, incorporate concepts of conditional fairness and under standardization into the standards. These concepts offer the beginnings of a scientific basis for personalizing assessment. That is, maximizing construct-relevant variance for you, for the individual, as opposed to on average. Third, consider whether some loss in comparability, which is what happens when we personalize, might be worth gains in validity and fairness, which is what's supposed to happen when we personalize. Fourth, encourage testing organizations to establish community advisory groups, hire diverse staff, and interact with examinees from diverse groups intensively to find out what it is that's meaningful and relevant to them. To date, testing companies as a group have not done very well on any of these counts. And finally, encourage what Ed Gordon calls deontic action. That is, acting on what it is we currently know. We know enough from theory, principles, logic, and research in other fields like the learning sciences to have assembled a reasonable basis for trying out some of the ideas that I mentioned and that others have mentioned in their proposals for new conceptions of assessment. Thanks very much.
Moving on to Professor Solano-Flores. Listo. Gracias.
So the title of this presentation is a kind of elaboration of the title of the paper that I wrote for this special issue. And the original title goes something like how serious are we about fairness and how far are we willing to go? And a response to Randall and Bennett, something like that. But in this case, what we have is a fairness in assessment. We are that serious, and the next standard should be too. Actually, we should cross out should, and we should say the next standards must be true. So when I was preparing the slide, I have to confess that I noticed this contradiction, but I was a little, worried about the proper use of I was issues of English as a second language concerns. That's essentially, I had English as a second language concerns from my side. Anyway, writing this response to Randall and Bennett was a very interesting experience, and I have to thank John Herman and Jose Felipe Martinez and Alison Bailey, and to the authors Jennifer and Randy, because we had a very interesting interaction, and everything in the process was transparent. There were no surprises. I mean, everything that was said was also considered by the other people, and we were able to keep our differences clear, the points in which we didn't think in the same way, and do that in a very constructive way. And it was an interesting process. Today, you are going to read the papers in the special issue. So I'm gonna try not to repeat myself, because I know that you're gonna read the paper. But I have to say that we have been talking about the limitations of the standards and how the standards are so far have been to a great extent a tool for social reproduction. And we have some ideas for the next standards, One of the things is that the next standard should consider more seriously that they talking about items that are culture free is an absurd. It's something really absurd. Everything is culturally influenced. Everything is culturally generated. So rather than pretending to come up with something that is free of culture and that will be understood by everybody or that will not hurt anybody, is an ideal that doesn't happen. And it's actually reflecting this fear of showing things that may be painful or uncomfortable to talk about or to see. So the other notion is students are not always taught the knowledge assessed in tests. It is very rare to see states, agencies, or leaders interpreting the results of tests in terms of the opportunities that students have had to learn the content assessed. And we know that when we pay attention to what actually the students have learned, there's no good match with what the students are being assessed on. And obviously this discrepancy is more serious for students of color, students of low SES, English learners, because of the limited sets of opportunities that they have in their schools. So we would like to have a new set of standards for educational and psychological assessment that talk more thoroughly about consequences of tests and also proper interpretations. Then we have the other notion that is what we mentioned before, the must and the should. There are things that need to be non-negotiable, as Jennifer said, and that has to do with many of the technical qualities of standards. And now that I'm mentioning of tests, and now that I am mentioning technical quality, let me say I'm going to start talking about my frustrations from now on in this presentation. Something that is very frustrating is that because I navigate across people with different professions, anyway, I interact with psychometricians, I would interact with people who develop tests, I interact also with people who are advocates for minority groups and people who are in the field of a second language and so on. So I have interactions with people with different theoretical and methodological approaches. And something that I find very frustrating is when I hear this discourse about tests, talking about the technical qualities and properties of the test, and then issues of fairness, like a separate thing. And Randy already said, why should we have fairness in the third chapter after validity and reliability and not at the beginning? Actually, I would like to propose something probably more ambitious. Why don't we have fairness issues cutting across all the chapters? I mean, the current standards, what you see is a development and review and so on, and all issues of fairness are treated as a separate, clearly distinguishable topic. I find that very difficult to accept. So we would like to see in the future standards that are discussing issues of reliability and issues of validity, along with issues of fairness. They are not, they cannot be separated. So there's some issues of fairness that I would like to mention, and this is about kind of my frustration as well, but also I want to propose some ideas. So, population specification. You have all those groups, African Americans, Latinos, English learners, blah, 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 that are not really considering the fluidity and the heterogeneity of groups. And if you tell me about someone who is an English learner, recently reclassified as English proficient, that is not telling me much about the details that I know as an educator to properly serve the student. That aspect is not sufficiently treated in current assessment practices. Conceptual defensibility. I can see still in respected journals those references to issues of culture that are not defensible, or at least I don't see the justification. For example, someone can say, we used problems that we know that all the kids like and understand. How can you know that? Because your kids like those topics? We don't know. Rarely you see a journal requiring more robust ways of justifying the choices that are supposed to address diversity. Inclusion and sampling. We have the situation that in research you see sometimes some samples of students of different groups reported, but not with sufficient detail. You don't know the procedures, how those individuals were gathered or included in a study. But in terms of testing, there's something that I have always mentioned. Assessment systems, large-scale assessment systems, should have population sampling frameworks in place so that you can decide what are the samples of students that you are going to include in the process of assessment development. If you are going to pilot an instrument, you want to have representative samples of students of different groups. I have suggested several times in different arenas this idea of the population framework for assessment. People like it, but they don't know how to do it, and I think that this is something that requires a good NSF or IES proposal. I'm not sure that I would be willing to lead the effort, but guys, if you I will be very happy to contribute with some ideas, but but it's a very good possibility. Data disaggregation. Look at this. If you see a technical report and it's telling you about the technical properties of a test, rarely they report the technical properties by group. In the moment in which you disaggregate by group, you can see that the technical properties are terrible for some groups, not for the mainstream group or let's say middle class or upper class white. When you combine all those groups and examine the technical properties, those technical properties may be inflated. And essentially, validity, issues of validity should be informed not only by differences in scores between groups, but also by information on the amount of measurement error that you observe in different groups. When you focus on examining measurement error, then you can see a serious limitation. I'm not going to be able to discuss each of these. All the bullets that I have, but these are some issues. I have so many other things to say, but in terms of producing something, proposing something that is practical, these issues typically are discussed when they are discussed or when they are superficially treated at the level of instrument, not at the level of assessment system. And I think that's something that is really serious, that is really important about fairness, is that we examine the systemic issues in testing. And what does I mean? Do I want to say here? What I mean is that we should examine fairness not only for tests but for the whole process of test development. And you see all these issues that I have listed here. These are the same rows in this matrix, and I came up with this that I call the matrix of evidence for validity argumentation. And what you see in the columns are things like policy and legislation, normative documents like standards, test development process, test and test administration, and so on. We could have many other columns there with other issues. So the crossing of those procedural assumptions and the assessment process components give us this matrix. And validity is about gathering evidence that confirms and disconfirms that you have something. So what happens if in this cell, in each cell in this matrix, we take note of all the sources and of evidence that confirm or disconfirm that we are actually, for example, if we pay attention to cell 1.1, that in terms of a population specification is the policy and the legislation that guides the assessment system. Is it really addressing these issues of properly specifying populations? I can tell you that there are big holes in the legislation. The legislation may be very vague, very ambiguous. It lends itself for a subjective and arbitrary interpretation and implementation. So if we gather this kind of different pieces of evidence, confirming and disconfirming for each of these cells, we would be able to have a good judgment of how the assessment systems are addressing issues of fairness. And we should be able to tell decision makers or policy makers and testing companies the things that need to be done. Of course, I recognize in many cases is not only a matter of how to do things, but the willingness of the people who have the process of assessment in their hands. Anyway, I'm going to shut my mouth. Thank you very much again. We will keep going with the conversation. Thank you.
Now I would like to invite Tong to offer some commentary. Thank you.
Good morning. First, I want to thank our UCLA colleagues for inviting me to participate in this very fabulous panel. And I got a chance to read the special issue in its entirety, learned a ton. And hearing the conversations today, the presentations today from the various presenters, and the extension to the papers that you have in the special issue, I learned even more. So I feel like I'm being very privileged to get a chance to come here and learn. So I appreciate the opportunity. So I have always been a practitioner my whole professional career. After I left graduate school, I worked in the different testing companies working on different assessments. I've worked on a variety of assessment types, K-12, admission, licensure, certification, which is my job today. So my remarks are going to be more or less very much influenced by my experience. And so I am a member of AERA. I'm a member of NCME, not a member of APA. I should probably get a membership. Especially at this pivotal moment on the next revision for the standards. And my presidency with NCME was 2020 to 2021. If you can fondly remember that horrific period of time. So my entire presidency was actually virtual. I think I saw one NCME member the entire, in all three dimensions in my entire term, and he's my neighbor. But it's also the time when George Floyd was murdered. It's also a time when many of the people looking like me are being attacked because of the COVID virus, and we're being called the virus, right? So I had the opportunity, the privilege at the time to be NCME president, to be able to have that platform and be able to really communicate some of the thinking around that. And they also triggered into some of the work that I want to do. Whether we like it or not, assessments do drive instruction. And so what are the things we can do within assessments to inflict the change that we very much want? So that was one of the things that I've been really thinking about and doing some work in the past few years. I was asked to limit my remarks today to what NCME as an organization really should think about with the next revision of the standards. And so I'll try to focus on that. The first point I have was, I think we should be bold, very, very bold. We need to be brave. Jennifer Randall mentioned that earlier as well. Have no fear. I think, yes, we don't have all the answers. We are going to make mistakes, and that's okay. But we need to be bold. We need to really take this on and think about, recognize the history, recognize what hand we have played in really to reinforce some of the racism. Whether we like it or not, that's the side effect, that's the consequence. And we have to admit to that and then think about ways that we can change it. So that's, right now the standards is open source. I would ask, continue for open source so that it's going to be widely available to everyone. But because of the open source, because we live in a digital world, do our standards continue to be, 2014 standards, and that's the gold standards, and then we're not going to make any changes? With what we're seeing, the fairness discussion today, it's almost unthinkable to see it will continue to be the same by the time we do the next revision. So open source would give us the flexibility in a dynamic way to update some of the pieces of it. So I would really push for that as well. My second point is be firm. Dr. Solano-Flores was talking about using must instead of should, and I totally wholeheartedly agree with that. We must do a lot of different things. We have academic standards, and we hold our students to it. We as professionals should have our own standards and hold ourselves to it. I would also argue NCME, AERA, APA should also think about some regulatory efforts. Talking with Allison earlier, saw some agreement there as well. So we put the standards out there. Can we put in some mechanism in terms of regulation and be able to really hold people to those set of rigorous standards, and they need to comply because our assessments do have consequences. My third point is around we need to be more inclusive. And the inclusiveness is more around, I don't think all the measurement professionals are on the same brainwave, if you will, around the fairness issue. And so as we think about the working group of the people, the very people who are going to put the standards together, should we be more inclusive, including people who are really for the standards, for the fairness type of discussion that we're having today, and also skeptical, the skeptics. This is probably not popular opinion, but I think we should, so that we know what we're against, because at the end of the day, we want test developers to use these standards to get how they should approach the assessments. I would also argue for inclusion, we need academics as well as practitioners. It's important to have both sets of perspectives. From the practitioner side, we need people who are in the K-12, who are in the admission, as well as licensure certification. All these assessments have real consequences, and their experiences will really help shape the standards and how they would continue to help us make the assessments more rigorous. Backgrounds, value, I would also probably want some international presence in the standards, even though we probably think that's more North America. But at the same time, we're making it open source. We are wanting a global adoption, so maybe we should have some international presence as well. My next point is we need to embed fairness discussion within the standards throughout. Randy is arguing for a first chapter being fairness, and I agree with that. But at the same time, it cannot be only one chapter. It needs to be throughout, embedded within. And my last point would be, right now the standards is a list of guidelines, regulations, and it's very dry. It's very hard to read. Only us want to read it. If we wanted to have more broader reach to people, if we want, say, our classroom teachers to really understand what the implications for them, could we also think about some commentaries for specific audiences to translate the dry standards for some of the potential users as well? So these are my points. Thank you.
And last but not least, we welcome Kristen Huff, who's joining us via Zoom. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Huff. I was not able to make it this week due to contracting the flu earlier this week. So I'm very, very disappointed to not be there. I was invited to today's conference in my capacity as the NCME representative to the Standards Management Committee, meaning for the standards revision. So just a little bit of organizational context, because there's a lot of organization when it comes to revising the standards. The three sponsoring organizations, as you are probably aware, are NCME, AERA, and APA. Each of these organizations appoints a single representative to the Standards Management Committee. I am the NCME representative. Michael Rodriguez of the University of Minnesota is the representative from AERA, and Fred Oswald from Rice University is the representative for APA. The three of us meet, and we have a charge to first determine if the standards need a revision. And then once that determination is made through surveying the membership, we develop a charge. We recruit the chairs and the members of what is called the Joint Committee. It is the Joint Committee that actually is responsible for editing and revising the standards. So what we have done in 2023 is we have focused our energies on, we have focused our energies on gathering feedback from membership. NCME and AERA gathered feedback from membership on whether and to what degree and in what way the standards would need to be revised. We spent January through March doing this. I hope everyone in the room there at UCLA filled out the survey. And these results were presented in April at a joint session of NCME and AERA. APA is a much larger organization than AERA and NCME combined. They needed a little more time. They gathered their survey results in August and September. Luckily, the themes all converged, and I will share with you what the major themes are that will drive the charge to the Joint Committee. Before I do that, though, I'd like to give you a little bit more about where we are in the process. Later this month, we're currently working with each of the sponsoring organizations so that later this month, and I'm pretty sure, Joan, you may be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but we're breaking precedent with the past in the name of transparency and inclusivity by doing a call for nominations for both the co-chairs of the Joint Committee as well as membership in the Joint Committee. Later this month, we hope to get the call out to all members of all three sponsoring organizations with the criteria that we would like to see for co-chairs, for the full membership, for individual members on the committee, as well as the whole committee as a whole. And to your point, one of the themes you will see in these criteria is diversity of perspective. That is really the driving theme through all of our criteria. And there are many different perspectives to be taken into account, as you mentioned. So this call will go out, we hope, by the end of the month. And one of the things we'll mention in this call is the three main themes that we learned from the surveys from across the three membership organizations. So one of the main themes has to do with usability of the standards. And so under usability, what we heard loud and clear is that the cadence of revising and updating the standards of every 10 or so years is just not it doesn't make the standards very timely and useful in today's world. So we are going to be looking at the cadence of how often and how the standards are revised so that they can stay current and relevant to people in the field. The other piece related to usability, and this was mentioned by a couple of the speakers, is the organization and format of the standards. So we will be looking at that as well, and as well as how to make the standards really come alive and be meaningful and actionable and useful to the various users in the field. So that is just a kind of highlight of the first theme of usability. Of course, the next theme, this was probably the strongest theme, is a revisioning of fairness and equity. And this, there were a lot of comments here about this. Not only in the topic of today's discussion with historically marginalized communities, but also the notion of accessibility to all students, regardless of the differences in ability, cognitive ability, physical ability, and really looking at fairness and equity in a renewed way as we move into the future of this industry. The last theme that popped out really strong, is about technology and how technology is not only changing how we do our work in this industry, but how we can better leverage technology, especially for accessibility. And of course, a strong sub-theme in there was the use of AI and the role of AI in our work. So those are the high-level themes, and we will be looking for co-chairs and membership to the Joint Committee who can help us take a deeper dive into the survey results and come up with a roadmap for the revision of the standards. We hope to have the co-chairs named by the end of the calendar year and membership of the committee named by the end of January. And from there, our next update to our constituents, members of each of the three organizations, will be at the joint conference for NCME and AERA in April in Philadelphia. I'm not sure where we are in the agenda. I feel so blessed that I was able to be zoomed in, and I'm happy to take any questions if that's convenient, or yes, or stop now, because I think you're a little bit behind schedule.
For sure, we'll keep you here in Zoom. So I would like to just ask our audience members if you can, I know we started a little bit late, we had always those transitions, but we would like to take 2 questions from the audience. So if we wanna invite the audience now to please come up with some fresh ideas. Do you want to come? Maybe, do we have another microphone to hand out, please?
Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you so much. Sessions. It's been very interesting. My name is Juan. I am a first-year PhD student. I'm from Chile, and I'm really surprised about the many similarities that you have presented in this context from the context of my country. So that made me ask, I mean, we are in a, I guess that this is a problem that is an international problem. It's not only here, it's not only Chile, it's around all the world. And we are living in a society that every day believes less in democracy, that we are surrounded by social medias, all elements that goes or can cause problems that goes against all what you just said. So in this line, well, first of all, if you agree that this is an international or global problem, and second, if that is so, if you know countries, or do you have an ideas, or to where we should look at to have some ideas about how to challenge, how to face this challenge? Thank you.
Thank you.
Megan, I will need you to repeat the question. I am so sorry, I could not hear.
If you know which countries we could use as reference to face the problems that you mentioned.
Which other countries? He's asking which other countries, Kristen, are facing similar problems.
In terms of the themes that were that emerged through the surveys, I would not be able to speak to that except anecdotally. I do not have any information on the country of origin of the survey respondents.
Willy, do you want to address?
I think this is I'm afraid that I'm not going to make you feel good with my answer. I don't know of any country that is doing in things in a way that I would like. I mean, maybe some aspects, but not really. These issues of fairness are so superficially, understood and treated. What I can tell you is that when you think, for example, about all this evidence about the unfair testing practices for specific linguistic groups or low SES and students of color and so on, when you see the process of assessment development, the inappropriate practices in interpreting the results of tests and so on, in the US, when you examine assessment development practices internationally, like in international comparisons such as PISA and TIMSS, you see at the international level the same kind of problems, the same pattern. Instead of having, for example, a so-called linguistic minorities, what you have is countries that are not politically influential, countries that are poor, that do not have the sufficient resources to benefit from those international test comparisons, and yet they are being compared inappropriately and ranked. And you see exactly the same pattern. So these things need to happen locally and globally. I mean, any change that we promote, any way of thinking, revised way of thinking needs to happen both locally and globally.
Thank you, Willy. I know we're a little bit stretched by time, but do we want to have, one more question then, please.
Hi, my name is Amira Cummings. I am actually pretty new to this conversation. I'm glad that I was able to be here and see these presentations. My company, we are actually creating what we're calling the first three-dimensional assessment of our kids. We're international, and we figure out what can a kid do at their level, what subjects they love, and then how many languages, because we're a multilingual program. And so my question to you guys is, how likely is it for all of your organizations or the standards to partner with private companies who are doing some of this? Because we have kids in 6 countries, our team is in 9 countries, and we're basically looking at this assessment deficit on an international level. And so for us, it's a matter of whether or not we're partnering with traditional academics who have rooted time invested. I've read a lot of the standards. I've read some of the papers that are here just to try and catch myself up with it. But in understanding how can we take the research that we've done around the world over the last few years to better help whatever's here, and then vice versa. Not sure who that question would be to. It's like, again.
You want to take it out? Randall, then.
Yeah, I think partnerships is one of the mantras of the current context. Problems like we are experiencing in assessment, in responding to diversity and the rapidly changing demographics of our nation and many other nations are very complex. And there's no organization that can solve it on its own. There's no discipline that can solve it on its own. So if we're going to make progress, we're going to need to make partnerships across many different organizations, across many different disciplines. And, I think that's the only way.
Thank you very much. And I do invite all of you to continue conversations. We're going to have a brief break, and we invite you to please join us at 11:05. We'll start the next sessions. One is on implications for measurement and psychometrics, where Felipe Martinez will be the moderator. The panelists would be Randy, Bennett, Lee, Kai, and Guillermo Solano-Flores, and Yi Tong too. And the second panel is implications for assessment, policy, and practice, which will be moderated by my colleague Allison Bailey. And the panelists are Heather Hough, Emily Walk, Julie Coleman, Ann Vasquez, and Jennifer Randall. So please continue to stay with us, take a break, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.